Donald John Trump, the former President of the United States.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, at this time, pursuant to Rule 4 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment and the United States Constitution, the President pro tem emeritus, the Senator from Iowa, will now administer the oath to the President pro tem, Patrick J. Leahy.
Please raise your right hand. Your hands on the Bible. Do you solemnly swear that to all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, now pending, that you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and the laws? So help you God.
I do, so help me God. At this time, I will administer the oath to the senators in the chamber in conformance with Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution and the Senate's impeachment rules. Will all senators now rise and raise their right hand? Do you solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, now pending, you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, so help you God? To call the names in groups of 4, senators will present themselves at the desk to sign the oath book.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young.
Microphone. It'll turn it on. The speeches, and I try to. Really, for me, I just put that little lectern.
Three. I'm going to get order first. The Senate will be in order. Senate will be in order. The acting Sergeant at Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silence on pain of imprisonment while the House of Representatives is exhibiting to the Senate of the United States an article of impeachment against Donald John Trump, former President of the United States.
Mr. President,
To the senator from Kentucky.
Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution says, "The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors." Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 states, "When the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside." As of noon last Wednesday, Donald Trump holds none of the positions listed in the Constitution. He is a private citizen. The presiding officer is not the Chief Justice, nor does he claim to be. His presence and the Chief Justice's absence demonstrate that this is not a trial of the President, but of a private citizen. Therefore, I make a point of order that this proceeding, which would try a private citizen and not a president, a vice president, or civil officer, violates the Constitution and is not in order.
Under the precedents of the Senate regarding constitutional points of order, including those of the Senate while sitting as a court of impeachment, the chair submits the question to the Senate. Is the point of order well taken?
Mr. President,
The majority leader.
the theory that the impeachment of a former official is unconstitutional is flat out wrong by every frame of analysis: constitutional context, historical practice, precedent, and basic common sense. It's been completely debunked by constitutional scholars from all across the political spectrum. Now, the junior senator from Kentucky read one clause from the Constitution about the Senate's impeachment powers. He left out another from Article 3, Section 2, quote, "Judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States," unquote. If the framers intended impeachment to merely be a vehicle to remove sitting officials from their office, they would not have included that additional provision, disqualification from future office. The Constitution also gives the Senate, quote, "the sole power to try all impeachments." So what have past Senates decided on this question? In 1876, President Grant's Secretary of War, William Belknap, literally raced to the White House to tender his resignation before the House was set to vote on his impeachment. Not only did the House move forward with the impeachment, but the Senate convened a trial and voted as a chamber that Mr. Belknap could be tried, quote, "for acts done as Secretary of War, notwithstanding his resignation of said office." The language is crystal clear, without any ambiguity. The history and precedent is clear. The Senate has the power to try former officials, and the reasons for that are basic common sense. It makes no sense whatsoever that a president or any official could commit a heinous crime against our country and then defeat Congress's impeachment powers and avoid a vote on disqualification by simply resigning, or by waiting to commit that offense until their last few weeks in office. The theory that the Senate can't try former officials would amount to a constitutional get-out-of-jail-free card for any president who commits an impeachable offense. Ironically, the senator from Kentucky's motion would do an injury to the Constitution by rendering the disqualification clause effectively moot. So again, by constitutional text, precedent, and common basic sense, it is clearly and certainly constitutional to hold a trial for a former official. Former President Trump committed, in the view of many, including myself, the gravest offense ever committed by a president of the United States. The Senate will conduct a trial of the former president, and senators will render judgment on his conduct. Therefore, the point of order is ill-founded and, in any case, premature. If senators want this issue debated, it can and will be argued during the trial. Therefore, I move to table the point of order, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
In this vote, the ayes are 55, the nays are 45. The motion to table is agreed to. The point of order is not sustained. Majority Leader.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I have a resolution to organize the pretrial proceedings at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 16 to provide for related procedures concerning the article of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crabo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
On this motion, the yeas are 83, the nays are 17. The resolution is agreed to.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I move the Senate sitting as a court of impeachment adjourn until Tuesday, February 9th, 2021, under the provisions of S-Res 16.
On the motion, is there? All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the Senate sitting as a court of impeachment is adjourned until Tuesday, February at 1 p.m.